large, the notion of an impossible world has been used more by example than by definition till now. So what I want to do is try to give you a definition. Now, the aim is fairly ambitious in a certain sense, because I want to give you a definition which is as independent of as many other considerations as possible. So the aim is to give you a definition that is independent of all applications. It's neutral on the ontological question of what a world is as such. It's neutral on the question of what inferences are valid. So it's logic neutral. And it's neutral on the question of what makes inferences valid. So those are some pretty important questions. And I want to try to give you a definition which doesn't presuppose answers to any of those. In a sense, what I hope is that the answer I give is acceptable to all parties for whatever they want to do with logically impossible worlds. So let me straight away give you the main idea. And the idea is this. What I shall be arguing is that a possible world is one which is closed under logical consequence. And an impossible world is one that is not. That's the main idea, but it takes some working out. And in particular, it's necessary to draw a distinction, which I think is often not drawn in discussions of impossible worlds. And I think this can lead to confusions, because those are different. I mean, what is a possible world? What is an impossible world, rather, is going to be somewhat different if we're talking about the worlds of formal semantics, or if we're talking about the worlds in reality, whatever that means, and I'm not going to have a view on that. The worlds of formal semantics are simply mathematical objects. They can be sets or numbers. They function a certain way. The worlds out there in reality, of course, are probably distinct from numbers and sets and so on. And this is an important distinction. The main difference for present purposes is that if you're talking about a formal semantics, they come with a consequence relation. That's given to you by the formal semantics. However, if you're talking about a bunch of worlds out there in reality, they don't come with a pre-packaged consequence relation. So you've got to work to get one. So I'm going to have to give you an answer to the question, which is different for those two things, formal semantics and worlds in Ray, whatever those mean. But the basic idea is the same in both cases, namely a possible world, which is one that's closed under logical consequence, and an impossible world that is one that is not closed. Okay, so this is where we're going. You've just had the introduction. Next, I'm going to give you a bit of historical background just to contextualize our discussion. I'll need then to tell you what I think a logic is, at least for the purposes of today's talk. And perhaps I should stress right away that when I'm talking about impossible worlds, I'm talking about logically impossible worlds. As you're probably well aware, the notion of possibility is highly ambiguous. There's epistemic possibility, physical possibility, deontic possibility, maybe metaphysical possibility. I'm concerned with logical possibility, and that's all. That's enough for one day. So in section 3, I'll tell you what I take a logic to be for the present purposes. Now, we'll then have to address the answer to the questions, and I've broken this up into 2. First of all, I'll give you an answer which is applicable when you have a formal semantics. That answer is relatively easy. Okay. in the 5th section of the paper, I'll move on to how you answer the question for worlds themselves, whatever they are. That's not so easy. By the end of section 5, I will have finished the guts of the paper. Now, there are other things which kind of spin off this. There are some technical constructions concerning higher orders, and there are various loose ends which will be raised in what I have to say, which might be taken care of. I'm going to see how the time goes. So if I get to the end of section 5, I'll be happy. If there's some time left over, then we might have a look at 6 and 7. But for what I want to get through, it's not necessary. So we'll see how it goes. So that's where we're going. Now, I can't see anybody, which is a bit disconcerting. Okay, now I can see a few people.
We are here, I think. Yeah,
good, excellent. Because, you know, we've learned to be very patient over the last year. But one thing that sometimes happens is the internet connection drops out. And if you can't see a few people who are moving around, you don't know that that's not happened. So it's always good to see a few people at least. It's good to see everybody, but that is not something that present technology really allows. Anyway, good. So let's go on. Let me start with the historical background. So modal logic. Modal logic has been investigated, well investigated, in the 3 great periods of Western logic: ancient, medieval, and modern. And much has been done in those periods. I think it's fair to say that modal logic had fallen into something of oblivion by the end of the 19th century. And it was rescued from this state by C.I. Lewis around 1920, plus or minus. And as most of you will presumably be aware, he invented 5 systems of modal logic, S1 through S5, in purely syntactic form, just as axiom systems. By the 1950s, I think modal logic had a somewhat bad taste philosophically. It had come under pretty devastating attacks by people like Quine, and there were a lot of people who were prepared to give it away. However, it was rescued from this state in the 1960s by a number of people who were working on the semantics of modal logic, and the most important of these was this guy. So this is a picture of the very young Saul Kripke. I think it's about 1975. And in a couple of papers, end of the 50s and the start of the 60s, he came up with what we now think of, correctly I think, as Kripke semantics. So these were semantics for modal logics. And whether or not they answered the Quinean worries, one may or may not think, but that they were so powerful that they had so many applications that the Quinean worries just disappeared. And they had, we have found so many applications for Kripke semantics in the last 50 years that I don't think any logician would be prepared to give them up now. Of course, what to make of worlds is still a contentious question, but that they are one of the most fundamental techniques in contemporary non-classical logic, I think, is not. So those are possible worlds. Now, Saul's original 2 papers provided semantics for S4 and S5, and it turned out that S4 and S5 were just 2 of a wide family of modal logics, not even the most fundamental, for which you could give semantics of this kind. However, they're not, S4 and S5 are now sometimes called normal modal logics, and S1, S2, and S3 were not normal logics. So the semantics of the first papers gave us semantics to what we now call normal modal logics, but non-normal modal logics were a different problem. And Saul solved that problem too, at least for S2 and S3. S1 was harder and came later. But in a paper in the early 60s, a third paper in the early 60s, Saul gave us semantics for non-normal modal logics. And what's distinctive about normal modal logics, or one of the things that's distinctive, is that the rule of necessitation fails. So from the fact that something is a theorem or logically valid, you cannot infer that its necessitation is a theorem or logically valid. The key to the semantics of non-normal modal logics is breaking that. And how do you do that? Well, you have a class of non-normal worlds. So the old worlds are normal, and then you have a bunch of non-normal worlds where the box behaves differently from the way it behaves in the normal worlds. And in particular, in the semantics of S2 and S3, at non-normal worlds, a logical truth, such as box A or not A, may fail, and a logical falsehood, such as diamond A and not A, may hold. So non-normal worlds are worlds where logically impossible things happen, because at a non-normal world, A or not A, which is a logical truth, may fail, and dually for the diamond. Saul didn't call these things impossible worlds, but it's a natural thought. And this was the genesis of the notion of an impossible world, as we now think of it. So the impossible worlds that are necessary for S2 and S3 are fairly basic, pretty simple. But since their invention, many more applications have been found for impossible worlds. And impossible worlds of a much more interesting kind have been used. So one of these is in the semantics of relevant logic. And it's a crucial technique in the semantics of relevant logic that any logical truth may fail at some world and any logical falsehood may hold at some world. So these are much more complex impossible worlds, but they're still fairly structured because they're closed under provable entailments, these impossible worlds. Now, another application for impossible worlds was found with the semantics of intentional operators, like belief, knowledge, but also things like fear and desire and so on. And the impossible worlds you need to handle those are pretty anarchic, just because people's beliefs and people's fears can be, well, pretty anarchic themselves. We're not talking about rational belief, we're just talking about belief. And people have pretty bizarre beliefs sometimes. So the impossible worlds you need in connection with intentional states, intentional predicates, are of a very anarchic kind. So note that impossible worlds, the sort of degree of impossibility of an impossible world can be a matter of, let me put it this way, the degree of there can be degrees of impossibility. So I think the impossible worlds of relevant logic are more impossible in some sense than those of S2 and S3, and those of that are used in the semantics of intentional notions are even more anarchic, even more wild. So that's the historical background, and it just sets the scene for what's happened in the development of impossible worlds in the last 40 years. As I said in the introduction, the notion of an impossible world has been used more by example than by definition till now. But mostly we know what we're talking about, but I want to tighten this up and give you a definition. So that's where we're going. Okay, so we're talking about logical impossibility, as I said. And what I say will therefore, unsurprisingly, depend on the notion of a logic. So the next thing I've got to do is tell you what I understand by logic, at least for the present context. So what I understand is this. We're going to fix a language, L, and for the moment, for present purposes at least, you can think of it as some kind of standard propositional language. A logic is a relation, which I'll write as the turnstile, pi, turnstile, gamma, where pi and gamma are finite sets of formulas of L. So this is multiple conclusion, and I'm dealing only with finite sets. Now that's no loss if the logic is compact, which it normally is. If we get time towards the end, I'll say a bit more about non-compact logics. But for the moment, let's keep it simple and take just gamma and pi to be finite. Okay, so it's standard to put various structural constraints on turnstile. These are sometimes called the Tarski conditions. And let me remind you what those are in case you have forgotten or didn't know. And I'm going to assume them. So we have reflexivity. If something occurs in your premises and your conclusions, then the inference is valid. Monotonicity, namely, if you make your premises or your conclusions bigger, a valid inference remains valid. So you must think of turnstile as something like, if all the guys in sigma are valid, then some of the guys in delta are, sorry, if all the guys in sigma are true or hold, then some of the guys in delta hold. Okay, and that's obviously monotonic. And the third one is transitivity. If A is conclusion and A is a premise, then you can cut it out and just go from all the premises to all the conclusions. So those are transitivity. That's transitivity or cut, as it's sometimes called. And I shall assume that a logic satisfies those three conditions. Now, there is one other constraint which is often imposed on a logic, namely closure under substitution. So if A is some formula, and S is a map from propositional parameters to formulas, A sub S is A with every propositional parameter P replaced by S of P. And if sigma is a set of formulas, sigma sub S is just the collection of substitution instances under S of all the formulas in sigma. That's closure under substitution, or at least closure under substitution is the thought that if an inference is valid, then substitution instances are valid too. So if you can validly infer gamma from pi, then you can validly infer gamma S from pi S. Now that's a standard requirement. I'll mention it briefly in what follows, but I'm actually not going to assume that. But it's a standard enough constraint. So I've told you what I take a logic to be. Now that gives us enough background to turn to the main question. And the main question, recall, is what is an impossible world? Let me answer that question first when we're dealing with the formal semantics. And the relevant feature of formal semantics for present is that if you've got a formal semantics, it comes with a consequence relation. So let's assume that we've got a world semantics for some logic turnstile. And let's suppose that validity is defined as truth preservation at all possible worlds. Okay. So the semantics will have some worlds which are officially designated as possible and some which are officially designated as impossible, like the semantics for S2 and S3. But validity is defined as truth preservation over all possible worlds. Okay. So what's a possible world? Well, you know, I've just told you, the possible worlds are the ones over which logical consequence is defined, and that's fine. But can we characterize the possible worlds in a more kind of intrinsic fashion? And the answer is yes, we can. So the possible worlds, at least the answer I want to give, is that the possible worlds are those that are closed under turnstile. So if you look at one of the worlds in your interpretation, if it's closed under the consequence relation, it's possible. If not, it's not. Now, that looks kind of anodyne, but it's not entirely toothless, because you may well think that that gets the answer wrong in some cases. So, for example, okay, sorry, let me just spell out that answer more precisely so that you know exactly what I have in mind. I've told you that a possible world is one that's closed under turnstile. What do I mean? Well, it's one that satisfies this condition. If you've got a valid consequence and a world W makes every premise A true, then it makes some conclusion B true. And as I said, a world is possible if it satisfies that condition. In other words, it's closed under consequence, and it's impossible if it's not possible. Okay, now, as I said, this definition looks straightforward, but it's not entirely anodyne, because you may think that it gets some of the cases wrong. So worlds may seem to be in the wrong place. So in some semantics, such as the semantics for intentional states, intentional with an S, a non-normal world or an impossible world may be closed under the consequence relation, but only so by accident. So if you think about the very, very anarchic worlds that you get in the semantics of intentional states, they can do pretty much anything you like. Pretty much anything can hold and anything can fail. But it could be that despite that, the way things turn out, the world is actually closed under logical consequence by accident. It's not a design of the semantics. It's just a sort of happens to be the case in this non-normal or impossible world. So the semantics will officially characterize the world as non-normal or impossible, but my characterization makes it possible. Now, I don't think this is a big deal, because, let me come back to that in a second, a word like that, you can simply move, okay? So you can just take it out of the official impossible worlds and move it into the possible worlds, and doing so won't change the consequence relation just because the world was closed under the consequence relation anyway. So the official definition of the semantics might class as impossible, but you can reclassify it as possible and that won't do any harm. Okay, so that's one way in which the world, my definition might be thought to be wrong. Here's another. In some logics, there's a trivial world where everything is true. And in some logics where there are no logical truths, there are empty worlds. And you might think, well, hey, the trivial world and the empty world look pretty bizarre, but they're closed under logical consequence, obviously. So according to my account, they're possible worlds. And you might think, well, they shouldn't be. Look, in the logics where those things can happen, I really think these are possible worlds. There is no violation of logic in them. However, if you don't like that, then you can just make a kind of an ad hoc exception and classify those as impossible as a special case. I don't think that's the right way to go. I prefer thinking of those worlds in the logics where they arise as logically possible worlds. But okay, we might argue about that. So that's the first observation. My definition might be thought to misclassify some worlds, but I don't think that's the case. The second observation is that the definition of an impossible world is that it's not closed under logical consequence. But that's quite compatible with it being closed under weaker relations. So in the semantics of relevant logics, the worlds may not be closed under logical consequence, but they're closed under provable entailments. In the semantics of, in the impossible world semantics for intentional states, they're not really closed under anything in general. So, as I said, the sort of degree of impossibility can vary depending on whether or not the impossible worlds are closed under some relation weaker than logical consequence. Okay, so that's the answer to the question when you're dealing with a formal semantics. And with a few wrinkles, that's relatively straightforward. Okay, now let's turn to the trickier question of how to answer the question when you're dealing not with the worlds of a formal semantics, but with worlds themselves, whatever they are. And the crucial thing here is that if you've just got a bunch of worlds, they don't come with a pre-built-in logical consequence relation. So we're going to have to work to get one. And that's going to make things harder. So let's assume that we've got a totality of worlds, one of which will I write as at is the actual world. Okay. Which worlds are possible and which worlds are actual? All right. I think a good clue here comes from how you might want to tackle a similar question for physically impossible worlds. If you ask what a physically impossible world is, a natural but not mandatory answer is that a physically impossible world is a world where the natural laws are different from the natural laws of the actual world. Okay, I think that's the right answer. There are other possibilities, but let's run with that. So if you apply that thought to logical possibility and impossibility, you're going to get this. A logically impossible world is a world where the logical laws are different from the logical laws of the actual world. What does that mean? So the question of what makes something a physical law of the actual world is a hard enough question. I'm not going to go into that. It's a familiar question. The question of what makes something a logical law and a world, as opposed to a natural law, a logical law, is not so familiar. And that's what we're going to have to work on. Okay. So what I need to do is explain that. And I'm going to explain it again using this notion that A holds at world W. But now notice there's a difference from the last case. First of all, we have no formal semantics. We therefore have no formal semantics to provide an account of meaning. Therefore, we're going to have to take L to be an interpreted language. Secondly, because we have no formal semantics, there's no question of a definition of what it is, of this relation, A holds at W. And so my answer is going to take that as primitive. Of course, there are important issues here, but for my purposes, that's actually a benefit, just because I want to make my answer as independent as possible of all other substantive philosophical problems. So I'm just going to suppose that however you catch up the details, you got this notion. All right. So we're dealing with an interpreted language, and what it is for a sentence that language told to the world is just a notion I'm going to take for granted. Now, let me tell you what an extrinsic logic is. And essentially, it's one which is truth-preserving in the world. Okay, so here's the definition. Turnstile is an extrinsic logic of W, just if from pi to gamma is a valid inference according to this turnstile, and A holds at W for every premise, then B holds at W for some conclusion. Okay, if turnstile satisfies that condition, I'm going to call it an extrinsic logic of W. All right. Now, that does not solve the problem, because extrinsic logics are not unique. Okay, here's a heads up. I'm going to assume that the logic of a world is unique. Now, I'm well aware that you might question that. You might be some kind of logical pluralist, in which case you might not think that's true. If we get time, I'll talk about how you modify what I'm going to say if you're a logical pluralist, but let's keep things simple for the moment. And let's just assume that the logic of a world is unique. And the trouble is that extrinsic logics are not unique. Okay, because if a logic is, if a world is closed under some extrinsic logic, it's obviously closed under any weaker logic. So extrinsic logics are not unique. So we need some way of sort of singling out one of the extrinsic logics. And you might think, well, okay, we should go for either the weakest or the strongest. That's not going to do you much good, because the weakest is the null logic, in which nothing follows from anything. And the strongest is simply that which is materially truth-preserving in the world. Either one of the premises is not true, or one of the conclusions is true. So those have little to be said for them in terms of defining a logic in any interesting sense. So that's not going to work. We need some other way of singling out one of the extrinsic logics as the logic of the world. How are we going to do this? Well, the trick is to look at what the world itself takes its logic to be. Okay, I'll tell you how we're going to make that precise in a second. But the extrinsic logic says nothing about what the world thinks of itself. It just says, hey, as a matter of fact, this is truth-preserving, this relation. We need some way of talking about what the world itself thinks its logic is. How are we going to do that? Well, we need some way of expressing this. Okay, let's pass that over. Now, if we were talking about physical law likeness, let's come back to that for a second. You can express physical law likeness with a modal operator. So one of the things that's different between a relativistic world and a Newtonian world is that in a relativistic world, nothing can accelerate through the speed limit. Whereas in a Newtonian world, it can. So you can distinguish between physical law likeness and physical unlaw likeness using modal operators. You cannot do that in the case of logical law likeness. The simple reason is that there are different logics in which have the same modal properties. So there are different consequence relations where exactly the same logical truths of the form diamond A are true. I'll give you some examples if you want to know. For the moment, just take my word for it. What this actually shows is that you're not going to be able to define logical law likeness with a monadic operator. The trouble is that logical consequence is essentially relational. You can't do it with a monadic operator. You need a binary operator because it's relational. Okay, so what we're going to do is extend the language with a new multigrade connective. I'll come back to that in a second. Double arrow. I mean, for all I've said so far, that connective could have been part of the language in the first place. And under certain circumstances, it will be. Maybe we'll come back to that if there's time. But for the moment, let's assume that you just add this to the language. Now, the syntax of double arrow is this. If the A's and the B's are formulas of our language L, then A1 through AM, double arrow, B1 through BM, for any M and M is going to be well formed. So you can think of this as expressing a logical consequence relation. It expresses that given the A's, one of the B's follows, or something like that. Now, notice that this connective is multigrade. And what that means is that you can have different numbers of things on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And I'm assuming that the different number includes 0. We can go into that if you want. But for some finite number including 0, you've got that some number of premises and some other, maybe other number of conclusions. You don't normally, it's very rare in the language, in the literature, where you meet multigrade connectives. You certainly meet multigrade predicates, but that's different. So you may not have met a multigrade connective like this before. However, it turns out to be just the thing we need to express what we want. Okay, so let's enrich the language with this new connective. And let's call the extended language L with a superscript double arrow. Okay, this is going to allow us to do what we want. How? So let's use, this formula, this double arrow formula, is a formula of the language like any other formula. So it's going to hold or not hold at a world. And as I said, I'm taking the holding or not holding as a notion I'm just going to help myself to. So we're assuming that the right-hand side here is well-defined, and I'm going to use it to define this relation turnstile sub W. And it just says that the B's follow from the A's according to this relation, just if that formula with the double arrow holds at W. So the truth at the world W of this formula here tells you, in a sense, what the world thinks its own consequence relation is. And if this is the case, I'm going to say that turnstile sub W is the intrinsic logic of W. Now, remember the game was how to single out one of the extrinsic consequence relation. I'm going to let turnstile W do it. Now, a word of warning here. As far as this goes, there is absolutely nothing which requires turnstile W to be a logic in the sense that I have defined it. So I put no constraints on the truth of this arrow sentence. So there's absolutely no guarantee that turnstile W is an intrinsic, is a logic in the sense I've used it, okay? So you've got to take the word logic here, cum grano salis, with a grain of salt, because it might not actually be a logic. Okay. However, if the intrinsic logic of W is an extrinsic logic, I'm going to call the world coherent. So a coherent world is exactly one where the intrinsic logic is truth preserving at the world. Okay. So in a coherent world, what the intrinsic logic picks out really is a proper logic, and it's a consequence relation. Now, since arrow statements that are actually true are truth preserving, I take that to be a constraint on any account of validity. We might argue about what a decent account of logical consequence is, but I take it that a necessary condition on an adequate account of consequence is that it's at least truth preserving. Okay. So at the actual world, the intrinsic logic does pick out an extrinsic logic, and so the actual world is coherent. Okay. That's all the hard work. So let's now put it to use. So I can give you the answer. W is a possible world if it's coherent and has the same intrinsic logic as the actual world. That's the way we're going to flesh out the main thought in this new context. And an impossible world is one that for which that is not true. Okay, so that is the answer. Let me give you 3 observations. The first is that if we assume that box A is true, if and only if A is true to all possible worlds, then the fact that one of these arrow sentences is true at the actual world guarantees that it's necessarily true, which is something you'd expect. The second is that impossible worlds may be of 2 different kinds because the definition is a conjunction. So there are going to be coherent worlds where truth is closed under the intrinsic logic of the world, but the logic is not the same as that of the actual world. So let's suppose, just for the sake of illustration, that the logic of the actual world is classical logic. there are going to be coherent worlds where the logic of the world is intuitionist or paraconsistent or relevant. That's what the world thinks its logic is, and that logic is closed. The truth that world is closed under that logic, but it's not a possible world just because the intrinsic logic of the world is not the right one, not the one that holds it, the actual world. So coherent worlds where the logic of the world is different from the actual world is one kind of impossible world, and those worlds are relatively well ordered. But there are going to be more anarchy is possible, because there are going to be incoherent worlds where the intrinsic logics don't even preserve truth. I mean, as I've said, there's no guarantee that the intrinsic logic really is a logic that is really is truth preserving in the world. So in an incoherent world, the world would kind of think, hey, this is a logical truth, but it doesn't even preserve truth. So, you know, it gets its own internal logic, it gets its own logic wrong, as it were. So it's pretty incoherent, but it's a species of incoherence. So, I mean, one thing we've learned from using impossible worlds for various applications is precisely that in an impossible world, anything can happen. After all, you know, once it's impossible, all bets are off. Okay. So a priori, you might have expected there to be incoherent worlds, because if anything can happen, well, then incoherence can happen. Okay. So that's the second observation. Third observation is that two coherent worlds may have all the same extrinsic logic, but different intrinsic logics. So that's because they can agree on L, but not on L arrow. So how might that happen? Well, suppose you take, think of a finite mathematical structure, think of its description, its diagram or whatever, and let that, the language of that description be L. Then that could be a description either in an intuitionist world or in a classical world. Because if it's finite, then it's going to satisfy excluding middle and so on. So for finite worlds, classical logic and intuitionistic logic kind of coincide. So the description of this finite structure is going to be the same in both the intuitionist world and the classical world. However, these two worlds are going to differ in their arrow statements, because in the classical world, for example, excluded middle is going to be said to be a valid inference, and the intuitionist world, it's not. Okay. Just coming back to physical possibility and impossibility one last time, the same thing can, of course, happen there. It's possible to have two worlds in which the same things happen, but in which in one world they happen because they're law-like, and in another world they happen because they're contingent. So we're sort of familiar with this kind of situation, and it happens under this account of logical possibility just as much as it can under physical possibility. Okay, so now let me see. It's 25 to 7. So I've got to the end of what I really wanted to get to. And that leaves about half an hour, 35 minutes for discussion, if I've got the timing right. I'm happy to go on, but I'm also happy to stop there and just get into the discussion. So who's chairing this session? Sorry, I've forgotten.
Dr. Priest,
Yeah.
The maximum time available is up to 5:30 o'clock, so it will be 1 extra hour. So
I thought we finished at 10 past.
Oh, okay, but that's just as an extra for the Q&A, if in case it's possible. But that depends on what you prefer.
All right, so we have 55 minutes for discussion, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, in that case, let me say a couple of other things. I won't talk for more than about another 10 minutes, and I'll still leave us plenty of time for discussion. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about higher orders. So we've talked about a consequence relation between languages of L, but we've now extended the language to this richer language. And of course, with the richer language, there's going to be a richer consequence relation. So we now have to worry about the consequence relation between the sentences of that extended language. And what we're going to do is pretty straightforward, but let me just sketch it. There can be consequence relations between arrow formulas. Here's one, it's just cut. Okay. So we need to be able to express things like that. And we're going to do exactly what we did before. First of all, we're going to define an extrinsic consequence relation, and then we're going to single out one of those as the intrinsic consequence relation. So a consequence relation at this level, next level up, is an extrinsic logic for the world if it's truth preserving, okay, as before, truth preserving at that world. But now pi and gamma, the formulas of pi and gamma all contain double arrow. Okay. So we need to be able to express, to get the intrinsic logic, we have to be able to express logical consequence at that level. So let's write what we've so far written as double arrow with the superscript 0. And we call what's gone before level 0. And now we're going to deal with level 1. So we're going to add a connector to the language terms double arrow 1. And double arrow 1 has the syntax you'd expect. Namely, a formula is something of this form when the A's and the B's are formulas which contain double arrow 0. So you can write cut like this, and I've sort of put in brackets to make it easier to read because it's a bit difficult to read otherwise. Now we're going to do what we did before, namely, let's define this relationship turn start at world W at level 1. Just if this conditional with double arrow 1 is true. And as before, there's no guarantee that this really is a logic, but let's call it the intrinsic logic of level 1 at W. Of course, the actual world is coherent at level 1 for exactly the same reason it is at level 0, namely it's got to be truth preserving in any language you like. So the actual world is coherent at level 1. And let's define W to be coherent at level 1 if the intrinsic logic at level 1 is an extrinsic logic, same as before. And a world is possible if it's coherent at both levels and its intrinsic logics at both levels are the same as those of the actual world. So you do what you think you can. Now, obviously, the situation repeats itself and you're going to get a hierarchy here and you can go all the way up. I'm not going to talk about that because those of you who've got your head around how the technique works can just see how it's going to go. Those of you who are not interested in this, you don't want to know anyway. So let me not talk about that. Okay, let's do a couple of the et ceteras. I'm going to skip over that one. Let's come back to the question of non-compact logics. So in a compact logic, if you've got a logical consequence between premises and conclusions, there are finite subsets the premises conclusions, well, put it the other way around. If a consequence holds between infinite sets of premises conclusions, then it holds for if and only if that holds for some finite set. Okay, so you don't lose anything by sticking to finiteness in the case of a compact logic. But if you've got a non-compact logic, that is not true. So how would you deal with a non-compact logic? Well, there are a couple of ways you might go. One is to move to an infinite tree, double arrow. So this is going to be the same as the finite tree double arrow we had before. But before there could be any finite number of things on the left and the right, now it can be infinite tree in the sense that there can be an infinite number of premises and an infinite number of conclusions, and this is still a formula. Okay, that's one way you can go. It's a bit messy, but you can do it. Another way of going is perhaps more natural, and that is to go from a propositional language to a first order language. So let's suppose you've got a first order logic where you can talk about sets and you can name them, you can talk about relationships between sets. So if you can do that, then you can define this, which is now, there may be an infinite number of pi's and gammas, simply like this. So because we've traded in the connective for a relation, we don't need to go infinitary anymore. Double arrow is now a binary predicate, not a connective. Let me just note that if you do this, then this arrow may actually be present in the language already. So up till now, I've assumed that you had to add it. But if you're dealing with a predicate language, and that language is a language of set theory, it's already there. So for example, Zumilo-Fraenkel set theory has classical logic as its underlying logic, and you can define the consequence relation of classical logic in Zumilo-Fraenkel set theory. So once you move to a first order context, you may actually not have to add this arrow. It may already be there, which is kind of nice. All right, final, etc. Let me talk about logical pluralism. I've assumed so far, just to keep things simple, that every world has a unique logic. The one singled out by its intrinsic logic. And of course, some people are not logical monists in this way. Some people think that in some sense, there can be a number of logics which are all equally good. Now, what that means exactly, I think, is somewhat moot, but never mind, we don't need to worry about that too much now. Let's just assume that we've got a bunch of equally good logics in play, and let's subscript the consequence relation with a turnstile L. So for each L, we need to know what it is for one of these multitude of logics to be intrinsic. To do that, we need, again, this double arrow, but now we need one for each logic L. So to pick out the logics, the intrinsic logics of a world, we're going to add, or maybe we already have, a bunch of double arrows subscripted by the L's in question. Now, each such double arrow L is going to define an intrinsic logic of W. Again, warning, this may not be a logic in the sense I defined it, but that's okay because in coherent cases it is. So a coherent world is one where the intrinsic logic really is an extrinsic logic that's truth preserving. So a world is coherent. If not now, its intrinsic logic is extrinsic, but if every intrinsic logic is extrinsic, and then a world is possible if it's coherent and has all the same intrinsic logics as the actual world, and it's impossible otherwise. So the technique generalizes to this, to logical pluralism, at least this version of it. Okay, there may well be others. Okay, so those are things I thought it worth pointing out, given that we had a little more time than I thought. So let me just conclude. What I've been telling you is how to define what it means for something to be an impossible world. And the aim was to give a definition which is as neutral as possible on many other matters. The nature of worlds, the correct logic. So this definition is friendly to whatever you think the right logic, if any, is, and a lot of other philosophical issues. So I take this neutrality to be a virtue. We have had to draw a distinction between answering the question for formal semantics, where we had a consequence relation to hand, and a discussion of worlds themselves, where we don't have a consequence relation ready to hand and we had to work to get one. However, I've shown you a way to do that, and I think it's kind of nice. Now, of course, because what I've said has been neutral on so many important philosophical questions, that leaves many, many important philosophical questions open. What exactly is a world in itself? What is the correct logic? What makes it so? Okay. So my answer to the question of what is an impossible world doesn't solve those questions. So it's good that there's something left for philosophical logicians left to do. But so I think the virtue of the project that I've been engaged in is this. If we're going to address those questions now, then if my account is right, we at least know what we're talking about when we address those questions. And I would hope that that might make those questions at least a little more determinate, if not easier to solve. And if I've achieved that, then I'm very happy. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Priest, for your excellent and rigorous talk. So we will now proceed with the Q&A. So as I mentioned at the beginning, if you want to ask Professor Priest a question, please write me down a private message in the chat containing the letter Q, and I will proceed to give you the word in order of the deliverance of the messages. So the first person will be Kevin Davey. So you may now proceed, please.
All right. Thank you very much. Sorry, I can't see Graham. There you are. Thank you very much. That was a really stimulating talk. So I was just sort of wondering if there's anything in this idea. This is sort of more about the nitty-gritty sort of technical aspect of the talk. So when I saw this double arrow, I thought about the ordinary provability predicate, say in that you can formulate in the language of arithmetic. And I mean, you can, from Gödel's second incompleteness theorem, you can construct non-standard models of arithmetic in which it's true that, provable 0 equals 1, for example. The model thinks that there's a non-standard proof of 0 equals 1 sort of coded in the model. Of course, it's not true that 0 equals 1 is not true in the model, but provable 0 equals 1 is true in the model. And that sort of seems to be a type of incoherence of the sort you were talking about. So I was just sort of wondering whether somewhere in the realm of these non-standard models of arithmetic that have sort of funny beliefs about the provability predicate, I was just wondering whether those could function as sort of examples in some sense of impossible worlds, even from the point of view of classical logic. Is there anything there, you think, or have I misunderstood things completely?
No, that's an interesting question. So we're in the second scenario, okay? Because we're trying to define this double arrow, okay? Yeah. And what you point out is quite correct about non-standard arithmetics and so on. The first observation is that models are not worlds. That's obvious in the case of possible worlds, because there are possible worlds in which you can make the sentence, this is red and not colored true. Okay. So one shouldn't be too fast in identifying worlds with models. Okay. But let's set that aside. Let's suppose you've got a world which is kind of like the model. Okay.
Yeah.
Then the phenomenon you're pointing out is essentially omega incompleteness, right?
Sure.
So how is that relevant? Well, first of all, it ain't going to happen in second order logic. So if you're dealing with second order logic, that's not going to happen. If you're dealing with a kind of first order logic, then it could happen, I guess, unless you've got the ability to express the omega rule.
Which in arithmetic you don't.
Not first order arithmetic, that's true.
Right, first order arithmetic.
So just having just having the double arrow at your disposal won't give you that, okay? Because you'd need to have sort of an infinitary version of this. So you'd have to go to an infinitary language to do it. So going to an infinitary language is an option. So there are a few moving pieces in play here. We want to know whether the models represent worlds. We need to know whether the logic of the world is first or second order. We need to know whether we're restricted to a finitary language. So those are all relevant issues. But if the appropriate answers turn out to be the right ones for what you intend, the phenomenon you're pointing to is right, I think.
Okay. Good. I mean, that would seem to be a sort of, to me at least, a more concrete example of an incoherent world. But I don't know, maybe I'm pushing it too far because I'm feeling some resistance from you. That's okay.
Well, I mean, there are these presuppositions.
Yeah. Right.
Now, the thing is, you're dealing with these models, right? So these models are agreed to be pathological because you're thinking of an intended interpretation. Now, I stressed that when we're dealing with the second part of the question, we're dealing with an interpreted language. And that means, presumably that there'll be an intended interpretation. So if there's an intended interpretation, you might well hold that your worlds should at least, satisfy the intended interpretation. So that's why I'm saying that there's important philosophical issues there to sort of think about before we get into the scenario that you suggest. But I agree that, you know, if the answers go the appropriate way, you could be in that situation.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now we will proceed with the next question. Now it is time for Lorenzo Bocafoli to ask, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Priest. It was really interesting. For me, of course, not so easy. So I'm deeply fascinated, but I should undoubtedly digest deeper the kind of argument. But I like it very much. I think it's quite difficult because of the depth and the technicality, the deep technicality of your work to make question immediately. But anyway, I was thinking about the book of 2019 by Mark Iago and Francesco Berto, about impossible words. I read something some months ago about impossible words and epistemic logic, doxastic logic, and deep and not deep, deep and normal epistemic impossibility. Do you think there is a certain possibility of extending your model in this direction of the epistemic impossibilities, deep impossibilities, degrees of impossibility from the epistemic point of view, including this ramification of inconsistency inside of a word, epistemically retracted?
Yeah, look, I don't think you've got to change the model, but if you're dealing with intentional states such as belief and knowledge, and these are not sort of logical idealizations, you're going to need impossible worlds, because what people believe may be inconsistent, what people know may be incomplete. So impossible worlds are a kind of paradigm application, or at least the use of impossible worlds is a paradigm application. Sorry, I'm garbling this. If you're looking at intentional states, then using impossible worlds is a paradigm application. And the worlds you need are pretty much these anarchic ones. For knowledge, not so anarchic. For belief, very anarchic. So what you're going to discover is that I've given you a definition of an impossible world, which works for any possible, for any application you think you might want to make. When you do the application to intentional states, you're going to find that sometimes the impossible worlds are going to be relatively well behaved. For example, they're going to be satisfy certain closure conditions. So, as I said, you know, impossible worlds, the impossibility of impossible worlds can come by degrees. And so the phenomenon you're pointing to certainly happens in the context which you're talking about.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I will want to ask a question. Professor Priest, could you please just amplify on application cases that have already been made?
Oh, okay. So the applications of impossible worlds.
Yes.
All right. So look, I mentioned some already. The original application was non-normal modal logics, S2 and S3. The impossible worlds there are a very straightforward kind. Okay, the box and diamond behave pretty uniformly across impossible worlds. You get them in the semantics of relevant logics, where to make it relevant, you need for any logical truth, you need a world where it can fail, and any logical falsity, you need a world where it holds. But those worlds are still relatively well ordered because they're closed under provable entailments, for example. Another possible application in the same ballpark is not relevant logic, but conditional logic. So there are some people who think that counterfactuals with necessarily false antecedents are vacuously true. I don't think Tim's here, but he's certainly one of those people. And a number of people, including me, disagree with that. If you've got non-vacuously true conditionals with logically false antecedents, and you have a world semantics, you're going to have impossible worlds. Okay, so that's another possible application. And then there are the sort of really anarchic impossible worlds of the ones we were just talking about, when you provide a semantics for intentional notions such as desire, belief, knowledge, and in general, if you're dealing with these intentional predicates or intentional relations, you're going to need really anarchic impossible worlds where pretty much anything can happen. So it may be that I'm forgetting some applications, but those are certainly major ones.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will proceed now with the next question. It is from Luis, but I don't know his last name. So may you proceed, Luis? Luis Estrada Gonzalez.
I know
sorry.
Luis. Hello, Luis.
Hi, Graham. How are you? Good to see you.